Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Let's Dev, where today we're continuing to work on our creepy cavernous exploration game. Now last time we changed up enemy behavior to have them hunt by sound instead of sight. This required tweaks to the player code so that they'd produce a sound to find. And we also dipped our toes into some new code with the addition of a vertex buffer to handle the creation of some stalagmites for our enemies to blend in with. It was an overall great productive step forward, which we continue marching on with today's plan. We'll be adding gameplay elements starting with the resources the player will have to manage. We'll then add ways for the player to replenish said resources. And finally, we'll also add a way for the player to fend off the dangerous hordes of cavernous monsters. Sounds like a plan, so let's get to the coding. First up was a global struct that would be used to keep track of the player's stamina and flashlight energy. Then, to test this would work, the player's stamina would drain when running, which ended up working. However, I was also almost immediately met with an odd error in regards to the vertex buffer. It wasn't a critical error though, so I moved on. Next, much like running, when the player focuses the flashlight, it would drain the flashlight's energy. And once again, this ended up working, with the sprite also changing the shape of the light beam to be more focused. So with the visuals working, we now needed to make them actually, do something. Back in the player code, using a mixture of distance and the player's view direction, a vision cone was created. So if the player is focusing the light and an enemy is within range between certain angle parameters, said enemy would be destroyed. And eventually this ended up working, after some tweaking to make the light beam good but not too good. Anyway, now that the player had vision, it was back to the enemy code to make this flashlight more than just an insta-kill. The enemy was given an HP variable and a stun boolean. If in the stunned state, I originally had the enemy simply run in the opposite direction of the player's position. I then switched to using pathing so that the enemies would avoid obstacles along the way. Once the stun timer has reached 0, the stun state would reset to false, and the enemy returns to its default behavior. And finally, when not in the stun state, the enemy would lose HP while within the player's focused beam of light. Hitting 0 HP would trigger the enemy to switch to the stun state to repeat the process. And testing was successful. The enemy would have its health drained and stunned, however the movement was very odd, and not what was expected. So instead of using the pathing code, I reverted to having the enemy simply run in a direction. This time, the direction would be of the light on contact. So instead of avoiding obstacles, enemies would simply run into a wall and stop on collision. The idea here was to make the flashlight work similarly to games like Slender or Alan Wake, where the beam of light is meant to deter enemies from reaching the player. It was rough and not an ideal start, but however it was a good start. So instead of obsessing over it, I decided to move on to ways to replenish stamina and the flashlight energy. We'd use a simple power-up like system where bottles of water would restore stamina and batteries would restore flashlight energy. In the collision for player to power up, a switch was used to determine which pickup affects which stat. Then, much like the enemy spawns, each floor tile had a chance of also spawning a random pickup, which ended up working, but also leaving us with even more that we'll have to balance in the future. In fact, that's a good way to describe this episode in a nutshell. Everything will have to be balanced in the future, depending on the type of game I'm going for. Should it be a fast-paced arcade-style game or a slower, more methodical adventure? I've still yet to decide, honestly. And I also wasn't expecting to run into an error with the vertex buffer, which weirdly enough, out of all things, I eventually learned it was due to the random chance code, which means that this is yet another area that we will have to come back to in the future. So yeah, a lot to think about moving forward, but the main gameplay loop has been completed. Next we have to figure out balance, and then eventually all the other cool stuff I want to add on top of that. In other words, much more to come. But for now, that brings us to the end of today's episode of Let's Dev. So remember to leave a like if you enjoyed the episode, subscribe and turn on notifications if you haven't already, and leave your thoughts on our progress in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.